The salt was still stuck to my fingers when I discovered my marriage was a lie. I had just pulled his underwear from the washing machine, the same pair he'd worn to yesterday's party, and there was a strange, crystalline stain that wouldn't come out with water. I rubbed it between my thumb and forefinger, and it dissolved on my tongue like tears. Salt, but not the kind from sweat or the ocean breeze from our Miami Beach apartment. This was different, concentrated, deliberate. My name is Diana, and from wherever you're watching this, stay with me. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't just about infidelity. It's about the moment I realized the two people I trusted most in this world had been playing a game I didn't even know existed. At 52, I thought I knew everything about betrayal. I'd buried my first husband at 35, raised 2 children as a single mother, and survived cancer. Twice. I thought life had already shown me its worst cards. I was wrong. I was 52 then, married to Roberto for 15 years. A good man, I thought. The kind who brought me coffee in bed on Sundays and never forgot our anniversary. He called me Mirena when he was happy, and held my hand during scary movies. We had built what I believed was a solid life together in our small 2-bedroom apartment overlooking Biscayne Bay. Not wealthy, but comfortable. Not passionate like my first marriage, but steady. Safe. But as I stood there in our cramped laundry room, holding that evidence in my hands, pieces started falling into place like dominoes I'd been too blind to see. The late-night phone calls he'd take on the balcony. The way he'd started showering immediately after coming home from work. How he'd begun buying new underwear every few months, claiming the old ones were worn out. I'd attributed it all to middle age, to the natural evolution of a marriage that had settled into routine. After all, I'd gained weight after my hysterectomy, and my energy wasn't what it used to be. I worked 12-hour shifts at Jackson Memorial Hospital, analyzing blood samples and urine tests. Coming home exhausted with aching feet and tired eyes. Maybe I'd stopped being the woman he married. Maybe this was just what happened when passion cooled into companionship. But salt doesn't lie. And after 30 years in medical labs, I knew the difference between natural body fluids and something else entirely. The party had been 3 nights ago, a celebration for Roberto's promotion at the construction company where he'd worked his way up from laborer to supervisor. I was proud of him, genuinely happy. We'd scraped together money to rent a small banquet hall in Hialeah, invited 40 family members and friends. Nothing fancy, but it meant everything to us. Roberto had worn his best guayabera, the white one I'd pressed that morning with extra starch. I'd put on the navy dress that made me feel elegant, the one he'd complimented when I bought it 2 years earlier. I remember feeling genuinely content that night, watching him laugh with his coworkers, seeing the respect in their eyes when they talked about his promotion. For once, our struggles seemed worth it. The overtime hours, the tight budgets, the dreams deferred. Roberto was finally getting recognition, and I was, the wife standing proudly beside him. I remember the exact moment everything changed. Roberto had been drinking steadily since we arrived, which wasn't unusual for him at celebrations. Dos Equis followed by shots of tequila with his brothers, the kind of drinking that turned serious men into laughing boys. But around 10 o'clock he stumbled over to me, his words slurring in that mix of Spanish and English he used when alcohol loosened his tongue. Necesito irme ahora. Ya estoy borracho y no quiero quedarme en la fiesta. I looked at him, concerned but not alarmed. He was swaying slightly, his eyes glassy but focused on something I couldn't quite read. There was an urgency in his voice that didn't match his level of intoxication. I'd seen Roberto drunk before. This felt different, calculated. Yo te llevo, estoy bien para conducir, I said, already reaching for my purse. I'd been nursing the same glass of wine all evening, staying alert because I knew he'd need a ride home. It was our routine. He drank, I drove. We went home together. But before I could even stand up, my mother's voice cut through the music and chatter like a blade. Disfruta la fiesta, hija, yo llevaré a tu marido a la habitación del hotel. I froze. The words hit me like cold water. We lived 20 minutes away in our own apartment. Why would they need a hotel room? And since when did my 71-year-old mother, a woman who complained about her arthritis and rarely drove after dark, volunteer to chauffeur my drunk husband anywhere? My mother, Carmen, was a woman who had raised 4 children and buried 2 husbands. She'd survived poverty in Cuba, immigration to Miami with nothing but a suitcase and determination, and decades of cleaning other people's houses to put food on our table. She wasn't the type to offer help unless there was something in it for her. But there she was, already at Roberto's side, her hand on his elbow with a familiarity that made my stomach turn. She was dressed differently that night too, I realized. Instead of her usual comfortable flats and conservative dress, she wore heels and a blouse that showed more cleavage than appropriate for a woman her age. Her hair was freshly styled, her lipstick bright red. At the time, I'd thought she was just making an effort for the party. Now the image burned differently in my memory. "Mama, that's not necessary," I started to say, but Roberto was already nodding, grateful. "Tu madre tiene razón," he mumbled. "Es mejor así." Better for whom? I wanted to ask. But something in their synchronized movements, the way they avoided my eyes, the practiced ease of their interaction, silenced me. I watched them leave. Together through the banquet hall's glass doors, my husband's arm around my mother's shoulders for support, disappearing into the humid Miami night. And just like that, they left together. My husband and my mother, walking out of my celebration like they'd planned it all along. I stayed at the party for another hour, making excuses for their absence, smiling through conversations while my mind raced. Roberto got too tired, I told people. You know how he works so hard. The lies tasted bitter in my mouth, but what else could I say? That my mother had volunteered to take my drunk husband to a hotel room I knew nothing about? When I finally got home that night around midnight, Roberto was already in bed, snoring heavily, fully clothed except for his underwear which lay crumpled on the bathroom floor. I stood in the doorway watching him sleep, studying his face for signs of guilt or satisfaction or anything that might explain what had happened. But he just looked like Roberto, weathered, tired, older than his 55 years. I picked up his clothes and put them in the hamper, not thinking much of it then, just being the good wife, cleaning up after her husband's celebration. Now, 3 days later, holding that salty evidence in my hands, I understood what I'd witnessed wasn't kindness. It wasn't family helping family. It was conspiracy. But here's what they didn't know about me. I'd spent 30 years working as a medical technician, analyzing samples, looking for things that didn't belong. Blood, urine, saliva, sweat. I knew the chemistry of the human body like other people knew their favorite recipes. And this salt, this crystalline residue that clung to fabric and dissolved on tongues with a distinctly bitter aftertaste, I knew exactly what it was. Dried. Tears mixed with something else. Something intimate. Something that shouldn't have been there unless Roberto had been closer to someone than a husband should be to anyone who wasn't his wife. The evidence was literally in my hands, and my scientific mind was already connecting dots I didn't want to. See, but my heart, my foolish, loyal heart, was still searching for innocent explanations. If you're enjoying my story so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and the price of being too trusting. The question wasn't just what Roberto and my mother had done that night. The question was, how long had they been doing it? And more importantly, how had a woman who could detect microscopic abnormalities in laboratory samples been so blind to the massive betrayal happening in her own home? But I was about to find out that some discoveries, once made, can never be undone. I spent the next week studying my own life like a lab specimen. Every interaction, every casual comment, every innocent moment between Roberto and my mother became data to analyze. And what I found was a pattern so obvious, so carefully orchestrated, that I felt like a fool for missing it for so long. The salt had been my first clue, but it wasn't my last. I started paying attention to laundry in ways I never had before. Roberto's clothes told stories I'd been too trusting to read. His work shirts occasionally smelled like my mother's perfume, that heavy floral scent she'd worn since I was a child. His pants sometimes had traces of her red lipstick on the fabric, faint smears I'd attributed to innocent pecks on the cheek during family gatherings. But there were other things too, biological evidence that my trained eye began to catalog with clinical detachment. Hair strands that weren't mine, longer and grayer than my shoulder-length brown hair. Skin cells under his fingernails that suggested intimate contact. And yes, more salt stains, always in places that spoke of activities no mother-in-law should share with her daughter's husband. I became a detective in my own home, and every piece of evidence felt like a small death. The worst part wasn't the physical proof. It was remembering all the times I'd been grateful for my mother's help with Roberto. When I worked double shifts at the hospital, she'd often volunteer to make him dinner. "You work so hard, mija," she'd say. "Let me take care of him." When I was recovering from my hysterectomy 2 years ago, she'd insisted on staying with us for 3 weeks, cooking, cleaning, making sure Roberto was properly fed while I healed. Remembered coming home early one afternoon during my recovery, still moving slowly from the surgery, and finding them on our couch watching television together. Roberto's head was resting on her shoulder, and she was stroking his hair the way a wife might comfort her husband. When they saw me, they jumped apart like teenagers caught by parents. "He had a headache," my mother explained quickly. "I was just helping him relax." I'd believed her then. Why wouldn't I? She was my mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything for her children, who had worked 3 jobs to keep us fed after my father died. Roberto was my husband, the man who had vowed before God to forsake all others. The possibility that they might betray me together was so unthinkable that my mind simply rejected it. But now, analyzing that memory with the cold precision I used for lab work, I could see what I'd missed. The guilty flush on Roberto's face, the way my mother's hand lingered on his shoulder a moment too long before pulling away, the fact that they'd been sitting closer than necessary, more intimately than appropriate. How many other moments had I misinterpreted? How many times had I thanked my mother for being so helpful with my marriage while she was systematically destroying it? I started a notebook, the kind I used for lab reports, documenting everything with dates and observations. March 15th. Found mother's earring in our bedroom, claimed she lost it while helping with laundry. March 22nd. Roberto came home showered and cologne-free after working late, but his clothes smelled like her house. April 3rd. Mother canceled dinner plans with me because she wasn't feeling well, but Roberto was also mysteriously unavailable that evening. The pattern emerged like a diagnostic test, revealing a hidden disease. They had been careful, but not careful enough to fool someone who spent her days looking for microscopic anomalies. What broke my heart wasn't just the betrayal itself, but the realization that I had been actively excluded from my own life. They had created an entire relationship in the spaces I left empty. While I worked nights at the hospital, they were together. While I slept exhausted on weekends, they found excuses to spend time alone. While I trusted them both completely, they were building intimacy that should have belonged to my marriage. I thought about confronting them, screaming, throwing things, demanding explanations. But 30 years in medical lab work had taught me patience. You don't reach conclusions based on preliminary results. You test, you retest, you gather comprehensive evidence before making a diagnosis. So I decided to run an experiment. I told Roberto I'd been asked to work an extra shift the following Saturday, a double that would keep me at the hospital from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. It was a lie, but I wanted to see what they would do with 16 hours of opportunity. "Que lástima," he said, barely looking up from his newspaper. "I'll probably just watch the game." But 20 minutes later, I heard him on the phone with my mother. "Diana va a trabajar todo el sábado," he said in the careful, quiet voice people use when they're planning something secretive. "Sí, todo el día." I felt sick. Saturday morning, I left. For work as planned. But instead of driving to the hospital, I parked 3 blocks away and walked back to our building. I sat in the coffee shop across the street, the one with windows facing our apartment, and waited. My mother arrived at 8:30 a.m., earlier than she'd ever visited us for any legitimate reason. She was dressed carefully again, in a way that suggested effort rather than casual family time. She carried a shopping bag that looked suspiciously like groceries for cooking, and she used her own key to enter our building. They'd given her a key to our home, our sanctuary, the place where I'd thought I was safe and loved. I sat in that coffee shop for 3 hours, watching the windows of my own apartment, seeing shadows move behind curtains that should have been protecting my marriage. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of them through the kitchen window, my mother cooking in my kitchen, Roberto helping her in ways he'd stopped helping me years ago. They moved together like a couple, comfortable and familiar, while I sat across the street like a stranger spying on the life I'd been edited out of. The worst moment came around noon, when I saw Roberto come up behind my mother at the kitchen sink and put his arms around her waist. She leaned back against him, and they stayed that way for a long moment, swaying slightly like dancers to music only they could hear. I had to grip the edge of the coffee shop table to keep from running across the street and beating down my own door. The rage was so pure, so complete, that for a moment I understood why people committed crimes of passion. But I didn't move. I sat there and watched my marriage die in real time, collecting evidence for a case I hoped I'd never have to prosecute. When I finally went home that evening, pretending to return from my fake shift, they were sitting at opposite ends of our couch watching television like nothing had happened. My mother was knitting, Roberto was drinking a beer, and our apartment smelled like the elaborate dinner they'd clearly shared. ¿Cómo te fue en el trabajo? Roberto asked, kissing my cheek with lips that had probably kissed my mother hours earlier. Busy, I said, studying his face for signs of guilt. Very busy. My mother packed up her knitting and prepared to leave. I stopped by to check on Roberto, she said. I brought him some of that soup he likes. The lie was so casual, so practiced, that I knew they'd done this many times before. How many Saturday shifts had I actually worked while they played house in my absence? How many times had I thanked my mother for taking care of Roberto while she was stealing him piece by piece? That night, lying inside bed next to my husband, I stared at the ceiling and made a decision. I wasn't going to confront them with tears and accusations. I wasn't going to beg for explanations or give them chances to lie their way out of this. I was going to treat this like the laboratory analysis it had become. I was going to gather irrefutable evidence, document everything with scientific precision, and then I was going to destroy them both with the same methodical care they'd used to destroy me. But first, I needed to know exactly how deep this betrayal went, because something told me the salt on Roberto's underwear was just the beginning of what I'd find if I looked hard enough, and I was very, very good at looking. Block 3. The evidence I gathered over the next month would have made any prosecutor proud. I approached their betrayal like a complex medical case, methodically documenting symptoms until I had a complete diagnosis. And what I discovered was so much worse than a simple affair. This was a systematic dismantling of my life, executed with precision that spoke of long-term planning. I installed a small recording device in our landline phone, the kind used in medical offices for quality assurance. Every conversation Roberto had with my mother was now archived, and listening to those recordings at night while he slept beside me was like performing surgery on my own heart. They spoke in code sometimes, referring to me as she or Diana, with a casual dismissiveness that cut deeper than any insult. ¿Ella va a trabajar mañana? My mother would ask. Sí, doble turno, Roberto would respond, and I could hear the anticipation in his voice. They had reduced me to a work schedule, an obstacle to navigate around. In their private conversations, I wasn't a wife or a daughter. I was an inconvenience, But the phone calls revealed something even more devastating. This wasn't just about sex or loneliness or middle-aged crisis. They were planning a future together. My mother talked about selling her small house and combining resources. Roberto mentioned divorce lawyers and asset division. They discussed my work schedule, my health problems, my difficult personality like caseworkers evaluating a problematic client. "She's always so tired," my mother said during one call. "Always complaining about work, never wants to do anything fun." "I know," Roberto agreed. "It's like living with a ghost sometimes." A ghost. That's what I'd become in my own life while they built their reality in the spaces I'd vacated. The most chilling conversation happened on a Tuesday night when I was supposedly asleep after a particularly exhausting shift. I heard Roberto's voice through the bedroom wall, soft and intimate in a way he hadn't spoken to me in years. "I love you," he whispered into the phone. "I've loved you for so long." "I love you too," my mother replied. "We just have to be patient a little longer." Patient for what? For me to die? To disappear? To conveniently remove myself from their equation? I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling while my husband slept peacefully beside me, and I realized they weren't just betraying me. They were erasing me. In their version of the future, I simply didn't exist. That's when I decided to become someone they couldn't ignore. I started with my mother's medical records. As a hospital employee, I had access to databases that most people didn't know existed. What I found was a pattern of doctor shopping, prescription collecting, and medical fraud that painted a very different picture of the fragile elderly woman who was helping with my marriage. My mother had been collecting anxiety medications from 3 different doctors, none of whom knew about the others. She had prescriptions for Xanax, Ativan, and Valium, enough to stock a small pharmacy, but more importantly, she was also getting testosterone, supplements prescribed for hormonal balance, highly unusual for a 71-year-old woman, unless she was sharing them with someone else. Someone like Roberto, who had been complaining about getting old and losing energy for the past 2 years. The pieces fit together like a medical puzzle. My mother was supplying Roberto with hormones and mood enhancers, keeping him chemically enhanced for their relationship, while I got the tired, depleted version of my husband. She was literally drugging him away from me. But the medical records revealed something even more disturbing. My mother had been seeing a fertility specialist, paying cash for hormone treatments designed to revitalize intimate relationships in mature women. At 71, she was chemically engineering herself into a sexual competitor for my 52-year-old husband. The level of premeditation was breathtaking. This wasn't a spontaneous affair or a moment of weakness. This was a calculated campaign to steal my life, and they were using modern medicine to do it. I printed everything: medical records, prescription histories, appointment schedules, payment records. I cross-referenced dates with Roberto's behavior, his energy levels, his sudden interest in vitamin supplements he'd started taking 6 months ago. The correlation was perfect. On days when my mother picked up new prescriptions, Roberto would come home unusually energetic and affectionate. Not with me, I realized now, but in preparation for her. But I needed more than medical evidence. I needed to catch them in the act, on record, in a way that would be undeniable in any court or family tribunal. So I did something that would have horrified the trusting woman I'd been just months earlier. I hired a private investigator. Carlos Mendez was a retired Miami-Dade police detective who specialized in infidelity cases. I met him at a Starbucks near the hospital, paying cash for his services like my mother paid cash for her hormone treatments. I gave him photos, addresses, schedules, and one simple instruction: document everything. "How long do you think this has been going on?" he asked, reviewing the information I'd provided. "I think it started during my cancer treatment 3 years ago," I said, the words tasting like poison. "When I was weak and scared and grateful for any help." Carlos nodded grimly. "That's when these things usually begin. When One spouse is vulnerable. 3 years. While I was fighting for my life, they were planning their future together. While I was nauseated from chemotherapy and recovering from surgery, my mother was helping by seducing my husband. While I was grateful to be alive, they were waiting for me to die. The private investigator worked fast. Within 2 weeks, I had photographs, video footage, and documented proof of a relationship that went far beyond what I'd imagined. They weren't just having an affair. They were living like a married couple whenever I wasn't around. The photos showed them shopping together for groceries, holding hands in restaurants I'd never been to, kissing in the parking lot of motels I'd never heard of. In one particularly devastating image, Roberto was carrying my mother's purse while she leaned against him outside a jewelry store. They looked happy, relaxed, like people in love. But the video footage was what broke me. Carlos had followed them to a small apartment complex in Coral Gables, where they apparently kept a love nest I knew nothing about. The video showed Roberto unlocking the door with his own key, my mother entering first, both of them. Comfortable and familiar with the space they'd clearly been using for months. They had a second home, a place where they could play house without my inconvenient presence, a place where Roberto kept clothes I'd never seen, where my mother had personal belongings I'd thought were lost or thrown away. I watched that video 3 times before I trusted myself to speak to Carlos without screaming. "How long?" I asked. "Based on the lease agreement I was able to access, at least 18 months, he said gently. Maybe longer if they paid month to month before signing the lease. 18 months. A year and a half of lies, deception, and stolen intimacy. A year and a half of me working extra shifts to pay for an apartment I didn't know existed, where my husband and mother were building a life that excluded me completely. That night, I sat in my car outside the apartment complex staring at the windows where lights glowed warmly behind curtains I'd never chosen. I could see shadows moving inside, could imagine them cooking dinner together, watching television, going to bed in sheets I'd never slept on. They weren't just cheating. They had created an entire alternate reality where I didn't exist, where they were the couple and I was the obstacle. In that apartment, Roberto probably talked about me the way he talked about his difficult ex-wife from before our marriage. In that apartment, my mother probably complained about her demanding daughter who worked too much and appreciated too little. I sat there for 2 hours, watching my life continue without me, and that's when I made the decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to confront them with evidence and demand explanations. I wasn't going to give them the opportunity to lie, manipulate, or turn this into a conversation about my shortcomings as a wife and daughter. I was going to destroy them the same way they'd destroyed me, methodically, completely, and with the clinical precision I'd learned from 30 years of laboratory work. But first, I needed to know exactly how much of my life they'd stolen. Because something told me the apartment, the prescriptions, and the 18 months of documented betrayal were just the surface of a deception that ran much deeper than I'd imagined. And I was about to find out just how deep that betrayal went. The financial records were what finally pushed me over. The edge from hurt into cold, calculated fury. I'd been naive enough to think their betrayal was just emotional and physical. But when I started digging into our joint bank accounts, credit cards, and financial statements, I discovered they hadn't just stolen my marriage. They'd been stealing my money. For 2 years, Roberto had been making cash withdrawals I'd never questioned. 500 here, 300 there. Always small enough to avoid suspicion but consistent enough to fund an entirely separate life. When I added it up, he'd siphoned nearly $18,000 from our joint savings account to pay for that apartment, the dinners, the hotel rooms, and God knows what else. But my mother was even more calculating. She'd been borrowing money from me for fake emergencies for months. Her car needed repairs that never happened. Her prescription medications were getting expensive. Her roof had a leak that was somehow never fixed. I'd given her over $12,000 in the past year alone, money that had apparently gone straight into funding her relationship with my husband. They were financing their affair with my own earnings while I worked double shifts to keep us afloat financially. Every extra hour I'd worked at the hospital, every overtime shift I'd taken to pay our bills, had been subsidizing their betrayal. I sat at my kitchen table with spreadsheets and bank statements spread around me like evidence at a crime scene, and I felt something inside me crystallize into pure, diamond-hard resolve. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about justice. I called my lawyer, Patricia Vasquez, a sharp Cuban-American attorney I'd worked with during my first husband's estate settlement. She listened to my story with the clinical attention of a surgeon reviewing a complex case. "Diana," she said when I finished, "what you're describing isn't just adultery, it's financial fraud, possibly elder abuse, and definitely grounds for both criminal charges and civil action." "What are my options?" I asked. "Legally, you can file for divorce with cause, demand full financial disclosure, and pursue criminal charges for the theft. Personally, you can make their lives very uncomfortable before you do any of that." I chose the personal route first. I started by changing all the passwords on our joint accounts and setting up alerts for any attempted access. Then I called the bank and reported the unauthorized withdrawals as potential fraud, which automatically froze Roberto's access to our money. When he tried to withdraw cash for his next romantic rendezvous, his card would be declined. For my mother, I employed a different strategy. I called her doctor and reported concerns about her mental state, specifically her apparent confusion about money and potential exploitation by unknown individuals. This triggered a mandatory evaluation and temporary hold on her prescription privileges, pending a psychiatric assessment. Within 48 hours, both of them were scrambling to understand why their carefully orchestrated system was falling apart. Roberto came home that Thursday evening furious and confused. "Mi amor, something's wrong with the bank account. They froze my card for suspicious activity." I looked up from my medical journal with practiced innocence. "That's strange. Did you call them?" "Yes, but they said they need to verify recent transactions with the primary account holder. That's you." "I'll call them tomorrow when I have time," I said, turning back to my reading. "I'm sure it's just a computer error." But I never called, and every day that passed, Roberto became more agitated. He couldn't access money for his secret apartment, couldn't take my mother to expensive dinners, couldn't fund the lifestyle they'd built on my labor. My mother called me crying about her prescription problems. "Mija, they won't give me my medications. They say I need some kind of evaluation. This is ridiculous. I'm not crazy." "That does sound strange, Mama," I said sympathetically. "Maybe someone reported concerns about you. Are you taking too many pills? Mixing them with alcohol?" The silence on the other end told everything I needed to know. She was absolutely mixing medications, probably sharing them with Roberto, and now she was trapped between needing them and admitting she'd been abusing them. While they struggled with these mysterious obstacles, I was setting up the final phase of my plan. If you're following this story and wondering how far a woman can go when pushed beyond her limits, don't forget to subscribe, because what I did next required a level of strategic thinking that surprised even me. I contacted the lease office of their secret apartment and introduced myself as Roberto's wife. Expressing concern about his mental health and financial decisions, I provided documentation of the unauthorized withdrawals and suggested they might want to verify his ability to continue payments. I also reached out to my mother's neighbors, elderly Cuban ladies who loved gossip more than their afternoon cafe. I mentioned casually that I was worried about Mama's new friendship with a married man, that she seemed confused about boundaries, that maybe someone should keep an eye on her behavior. In Miami's tight-knit Cuban community, reputation is everything. Within a week, my mother's phone was ringing constantly with concerned friends, asking pointed questions about her relationship with her son-in-law. But the masterstroke came when I discovered something in Roberto's email that changed everything. Hidden in his sent messages was correspondence with a divorce attorney, outlining a strategy to leave me with nothing, while claiming I was mentally unstable from my cancer treatments, and prescription medication side effects. They weren't just planning to abandon me. They were planning to destroy my credibility, take my savings, and leave me isolated and broke while they started fresh with assets I'd helped them accumulate. That email was my smoking gun. It proved premeditation, financial planning, and a level of calculated cruelty that went beyond simple infidelity. They were trying to erase me completely and legally steal everything I'd worked for. I forwarded that email to Patricia, along with every piece of evidence I'd gathered over the past 2 months. Then I sat back and waited for the perfect moment to deploy the nuclear option, because now I knew exactly how to hurt them in ways that would echo for years. And I was finally ready to stop being the victim of their story and become the author of their downfall. The perfect moment came on a Tuesday morning when Roberto thought I was at work. I had called in sick, but instead of staying home, I parked outside our building and watched him leave for what I knew would be another rendezvous with my mother. That's when I struck. I let myself into their secret apartment using the duplicate key I'd had made from photographs Carlos had taken. Walking into that space was like stepping into an alternate universe where I had been completely erased. They had photos together on the nightstand, matching bathrobes hanging in the closet, and a coffee mug set with his and hers printed in Spanish. But what broke my heart and hardened my resolve simultaneously was finding a wedding dress hanging in the bedroom closet. My mother's size, ivory silk, with the tags still attached. They weren't just planning to leave me. They were planning to replace me entirely. I photographed everything, then carefully placed copies of all my evidence on their kitchen table, like a prosecutor laying out a case. Bank statements showing the stolen money, medical records proving my mother's prescription fraud, photos from the private investigator, and finally, Roberto's email correspondence with the divorce attorney. Then I called them both and told them to meet me at the apartment immediately. There was an emergency they needed to know about. They arrived within 20 minutes, my mother clutching Roberto's arm like a guilty teenager. When they saw me sitting calmly at their kitchen table surrounded by evidence, their faces went through a spectrum of emotions: confusion, recognition, and finally, pure terror. "Sit down," I said quietly. "Both of you." "Diana, we can explain," Roberto started. "No," I interrupted. "You can listen." I had rehearsed this moment for weeks, but seeing them together in their love nest, wearing matching gilt, I felt surprisingly calm. I know about the apartment. I know about the money. I know about the prescriptions, the divorce lawyer, and your plans to have me declared mentally incompetent. My mother began crying, but they were manipulative tears, the kind she'd used to control me my entire life. "Mija, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly, Mama. You seduced my husband while I was fighting cancer, stole my money to fund your affair, and planned to destroy my reputation so you could steal my life. But here's what they didn't expect. I wasn't there to fight or beg or demand explanations. I was there to deliver consequences." "Roberto," I said, sliding divorce papers across the table. "You're being served. Patricia filed these this morning. You have 30 days to respond, and given the evidence of financial fraud and adultery, you'll be lucky to leave this marriage with your car." His face went white. "Diana, please, we can work this out." "And Mama," I continued, turning to the woman who had given me life and then systematically tried to destroy it, "I've reported your prescription fraud to Medicare and the DEA. There will be an investigation, possibly criminal charges." She stopped crying immediately. "You wouldn't do that to your own mother. You did worse to your own daughter." I stood up and walked toward the door, then turned back for the final blow. "Oh, and I contacted the building management. This lease was signed using fraudulent financial information from our joint accounts. You have 7 days to vacate." But the real twist came as I reached for the door handle. Roberto, desperate and cornered, played his last card. "She seduced me," he shouted, pointing at my mother. "She came to me when you were sick. She offered me things you couldn't give me anymore. I was weak, but she planned this whole thing. My mother's face transformed from victim to predator in an instant. Mentiroso! You begged me to leave her. You said she was cold, that she never loved you the way I could. And there it was. Even in their downfall, they were willing to destroy each other to save themselves. I watched them turn on each other like animals, each revealing uglier truths in their desperation to appear less guilty. She drugged you with those hormones, Roberto, I said quietly. Did you know that? The energy pills she gave you? They were testosterone supplements stolen from other patients. Roberto looked at my mother with growing horror. The vitamins. You said they were natural. Supplements. And Roberto, I said to my mother, did you know he was planning to have me committed to take control of my pension and medical benefits? It's all in his emails to the lawyer. The betrayal was complete. They had betrayed me. And now they were betraying each other with the same casual cruelty they'd shown me for years. I left them screaming at each other in their crumbling paradise and drove to the real prize of my revenge. Because while they'd been planning my destruction, I'd been planning something far more permanent, using the power of attorney Roberto had given me. During my cancer treatment, a document they'd forgotten existed. I had quietly transferred ownership of our apartment, our car, and all joint assets into my name alone. Legally, he now owned nothing, and my mother had no claim to any of it. But the sweetest justice was yet to come, because the story of their affair, complete with photographs and documentation, was about to become very public in ways that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't what you take from people. It's what you leave them with. 2 years have passed since that Tuesday morning in their secret apartment, and I'm sitting in my new home in Coral Gables, writing this story in a sunroom that overlooks a garden I planted with my own hands. The woman who discovered salt on her husband's underwear feels like a stranger to me now. Someone naive and trusting who I remember with compassion, but no longer recognize. The legal consequences were swift and devastating for both of them. Roberto's divorce settlement left him with his clothes and his truck, nothing more. The financial fraud charges resulted in a criminal record and a judgment that garnished his wages for the next 5 years. My mother's prescription fraud investigation led to federal charges, community service, and the loss of her Medicare benefits. At 73, she lost everything she'd schemed to protect, but the social consequences were what truly destroyed them. In Miami's tight-knit Cuban community, their story spread like wildfire. I didn't have to say a word. Their neighbors, friends, and family members did it for me. Roberto couldn't find work in construction because word had spread about his character. My mother was shunned by her church, her social groups, and even some family members who couldn't forgive her betrayal of her own daughter. The apartment they'd shared was foreclosed when they couldn't make payments without access to my money. They ended up living separately in efficiency apartments in Hialeah, their dream of a romantic future reduced to 2 bitter people who destroyed each other as thoroughly as they'd tried to destroy me. Roberto calls sometimes late at night, when I imagine he's drinking and remembering what he threw away. I don't answer. My mother sends letters through relatives, asking for forgiveness and financial help. I return them unopened. Some people deserve second chances. They use theirs to dig deeper holes. But this story isn't really about them anymore. It's about what happened to me in the aftermath, when the anger burned out, and I was left with the question every betrayed woman faces. Now what? I could have remained bitter, could have spent my remaining years nursing grievances and telling anyone who'd listen how I'd been wronged. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I used the money I recovered from their fraud, combined with my divorce settlement, to start something meaningful. I opened a small counseling practice, specializing in women over 50 who'd experienced betrayal by family members. Not therapy exactly, but practical guidance for women learning to rebuild their lives after the people they trusted most had shattered their worlds. I've helped dozens of women navigate divorce proceedings, investigate financial fraud, and most importantly, rediscover their own worth after being discarded by people who should have protected them. The work has taught me something powerful. Betrayal reveals character, but how you respond to betrayal defines it. I could have let Roberto and my mother's cruelty make me cruel. Instead, I let it make me careful, strategic, and ultimately free. I've learned to trust again, slowly, and with boundaries I never knew I needed. Last year, I started dating a retired doctor named James, who treats me with the respect and affection I'd forgotten I deserved. He knows my story and admires how I handled it, which tells me everything I need to know about his character. My relationship with my remaining family members has been rebuilt on new terms. My brothers and sister initially tried to pressure me to forgive and forget for the sake of family unity. I explained calmly that unity built on tolerating abuse isn't unity at all. It's complicity. Some understood, others didn't. I've learned to live peacefully with both responses. The salt that started this whole revelation sits in a small vial on my desk, a reminder that truth has a way of crystallizing when you're brave enough to examine it closely. Sometimes I show it to my clients when they're struggling to believe their own instincts, when they're second-guessing evidence that seems too terrible to accept. Trust what you can see and test and prove, I tell them. Your heart might lie to you out of hope or fear, but facts don't lie. People ask me if I ever regret how harshly I responded to Roberto and my mother's betrayal. The answer is no, never. They didn't just cheat or lie. They systematically planned to destroy my financial security, my mental health, and my reputation. They used my love against me and my trust as a weapon. That level of premeditated cruelty deserved exactly the consequences they received. But more than that, my response saved other women from suffering the same fate. Roberto can't seduce another lonely wife because his reputation precedes him. My mother can't manipulate another daughter because her community knows exactly who she is beneath the facade of maternal devotion. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give the world is making sure dangerous people can't harm anyone else. I sleep peacefully now in a house where every lock knows only my touch, where every decision is mine, where every relationship exists because I choose it, not because I'm obligated by blood or law to endure it. At 54, I'm more content than I was at 24, more confident than I was at 34, and more certain of my worth than I've ever been. The girl who once tasted salt and discovered betrayal became a woman who learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable people who hurt you, even when they're family. If my story has touched you, if you've recognized yourself in my journey from victim to victor, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Share this story with women who need to hear that they're not powerless, that they're not obligated to accept betrayal with grace, and that sometimes the most beautiful revenge is simply living well without the people who tried to destroy you. My name is Diana, and I'm 54 years old. I've learned that the strongest foundations are built not on trust that's never been tested, but on boundaries that have been enforced. Some people earn their place in your life, others forfeit it. The choice of which category people belong in is always, ultimately, yours.